All right, we just turned in our second exercise. So now, if we go to unit modules or if we go to modules on the side, we're out of our exercises and on to Unit 4. Unit 4 relates to what we did with Exercise 1 and the line art jumble, finding good references, putting them together. It's a raster project. It is a compositing project. But this is our first compositing assignment. This is assignment 1. And we are not compositing a creature. We are not compositing a jumble. We are not compositing line art. We are compositing what we feel is a believable landscape. Believable not in that it's realistic, believable in that it follows its own rules, right? So what you can't have is like a Looney Tunes tree, a Dora the Explorer mountain, a photograph of clouds and a sky, and a cat in the hat bench, right? Because those elements all have a different light logic, they have a different way of using perspective, they're not going to fit believably into the same world. So you won't see a video game that mixes and matches styles and elements that way, unless they have this really creative way of making it all work, right? So you get to pick your concept, but the believability of it is just in seaming the references and hiding that they're from different sources so they all feel like they belong together. Yeah, exactly. So Smash Bros, you can have different levels from different games, totally different types of shading, different environments. But if they're all consistent in that environment, then you can put any character on it and it makes sense, right? Same thing here. To do this, we have to sketch our vision first and then execute it through manipulating found pixels or even our own photographs. We're going to start this. There's 2 deliverables, 2 things you turn in for this unit. And the first is called the question of the day. This is just a way of kind of journaling and note-taking. This will be helpful to a discussion we have in class, next class. But now that we're getting into an actual assignment using other people's pixels, we want to think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of making a landscape or making art in general with digital tools versus making it with traditional tools. So this is a composited image of like a tree, house, an escalator, a face in a tree, a pregnant bump in a tree. Certain things are not very good about this image. This is a Creative Commons open source image from Pixabay. Both of these are. But this one's done digitally, and then this is a landscape with a tree done with ink and watercolor on rice paper, done traditionally. Though, of course, this is a digital image of that. And the emphasis, where you spend time, what you labor over, what you're trying to get, can be very different if you're doing something traditionally or digitally. And there are definitely advantages and disadvantages, right? One big difference, though, and this is why I mentioned the dangers, and this will lead into our discussions, is that this image can be copied perfectly. Except for the resolution of this, which has been shrunken down for Canvas, that image is exactly as that digital artist created it and put it up to Pixabay at full resolution. Not one pixel is different. This image has been digitized and is very different than the pigment and binder and ink and rice paper fibers that make the actual object. It would be very difficult to get an exact copy of that thing, right? Now, that's really helpful if this digital artist wants to get their work out, to share it and show what they've done. It's so helpful in the digital realm that the traditional artist uses digital art to do the same thing, except that traditional artist doesn't get to show people what the real thing is unless they come see it in person, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, it's a lot easier to steal things digitally than to actually go into someone's studio and steal their artwork. I have a link that just goes back to our intro slides to kind of remember what makes art digital and then what are some of the things going on right now with it, whether it's AI or whether it's just appropriation in general, which has been going on in analog ways as well, and then especially to remind you what compositing is, right? Because there are definite advantages to this, that if you are only able to put everything into one exposure in a camera, our visual language of photography would be vastly limited. And there are ways of compositing in the darkroom with multiple exposures, not using digital at all, but digital definitely makes it more accessible to people. Let's go back. All right, so to get questions for these questions of the day, we only have 4 of them through the semester, but all you have to do is to write on this question in a way that makes sense with your own ideas with more than 100 words. Make sure you try to address each part of the question. And if you want, because it's actually a little bit better for some people to write longhand, you can just attach a photo from a notebook. You don't need to type it, right? Though it is nice that if you type it, and most students don't have a problem with that, Canvas does keep track of your word count as you do it. But it doesn't count to just put your name. That won't count towards your word count. Or to recopy the question. What are the advantages? That kind of thing. But you can see, like, I'm already at 5 words. This is just my way of getting you to take notes in some way on some of the big themes of the class, right? So this is a good intro. And we do it in a public discussion. Well, not public, but public to the rest of your classmates, so that you can get ideas from what other people think of. They might jog your own thinking, and then you can add what you think, right? We can even get a little virtual discussion going if you wanted to here. But as long as you answer with more than 100 words, you get credit. If you do it by tonight, by 11:59, then it won't show up late in your grade book. And this isn't a major assignment, but I just wanted to make sure you're aware of it by the deadline. And then it will fuel our discussions in the next few classes. Our next question of the day will be on copyright. And our next question of the day requires that you have read Chapter 2, which is linked in your course outline, so that you're not coming to it with no information, right? Chapter 2 is the one that's about Creative Commons and about public domain, fair use, and actually gives some cited legal definitions that can help in that discussion. And we will discuss this next class. Okay, moving from that, we go to the next part, and we get the intro to our first assignment. So, fantasy landscape. Fantasy landscapes are not just weird stuff put together. You have to think about where is it, when is it, what would the lighting be like, what kind of color palette do I want, what kind of atmosphere, tone, feeling, whether it's a high desert in a portrait format, whether it's glaciers and sea, whether it's crystals and mountains and a solar eclipse. And you can see more examples on the Imgur. To do this, you do have to be logged in to the class Imgur, and that's all under links. So if you want to log in, I won't put it on the public YouTube. But you can see sketches and then finished products. These are the things you're submitting. Sketches, then finished product. I want you to sketch in both portrait format and landscape format, and then choose which one you like best to actually build your project. That's going to show you how versatile these different reference images can be. So what we're not doing is finding a really great image that like fills a big rectangle and then just putting little stickers on it of other stuff. Because that's not transforming the composition, right? So we really want to transform these compositions, and we do that by sketching out the idea first. So right from his sketch, in Jeremy's, the one I passed around, he had the Space Needle right in the middle. By the time of the end of it, he offset it a little bit to go with his other references. And I think the Space Needle was the only one that was an actual, just regular photo found online. And the rest were from like in-game footage of these different games he was playing. That might have been a real apartment building too. But notice, all of these are lifeless. It doesn't mean they all look dreary, but it means they have no figurative content. There's not going to be figures, there's not going to be animals, anything you would expect to be moving, right? And sometimes the sketch shows how references that they wanted to use might be combined, and then it will change a little bit when you actually put it together. And that's because a good landscape has a really recognizable foreground, middle ground, and background. And so in her sketch, this student had their city in the foreground, in that bottom corner. But by doing that and then having another city in the background, they're so similar, it really flattened the depth of the landscape. So instead, with some work, they extended the space for this foreground element and put the city in the middle ground, and then really both cities in the middle ground, and then the background is this extra mountain range that's added to get those 3 layers of depth. Now, figurative elements are anything we expect to be moving. So that's animals, that's people, that's vehicles that look operational, right? But it's also things like fire. So flames we expect to be moving. Smoke pouring out of a burnt vehicle, we expect the smoke to be moving. Those are all to kind of be avoided for this. Think of it as a backdrop for a play. Because next we're going to be designing composite creatures, and then we're going to be putting those composite creatures into these environments, right? And then we'll have the option to animate them. So you don't want to have too many things you would have to animate along with your creature. So I love this one. It does a lot of things really well, but one difficulty it builds into it is by having waterfalls, that's moving water. And so when they wanted to animate a creature into it, they also had to animate the water. Otherwise it looks like the water is just a sticker. Does that make sense? So think that through. This is how concept art works. So if we just Google for some inspiration, fantasy landscape concept art, it all looks incredibly similar, unfortunately. Most of this is done for feature films, for video games, sometimes for animated movies. And fantasy is its own genre, right? And we're just using it more openly as it's your own invention. So it doesn't mean it has to fit into Lord of the Rings or into Avatar, or even just be like a post-apocalyptic young adult thing. What's interesting about it is this is what digital artists do to give projects their scope before you actually even define the full budget for the project. So concept art kind of gives you a vision of what it could be. And so much of the really great concept art never gets turned into anything marketable, but those concept artists do get paid and have good jobs. And it's based on working fast and being very clear and evocative with your work. So in order to do concepts that are really clear and fast, these artists do not hand paint everything. They sketch what they want, but then they'll often composite huge parts of it, right? Especially things that are man-made like buildings. And then they'll manipulate them like we've been doing. You might even reuse the same things you used for another composite to do different versions, different ways, different seasons. So it's all using pixels. Sometimes your own, sometimes other people's. But what you'll notice in good concept art, you'll always see foreground, middle ground, background. So that characters can just slip right into it. Like these foreground characters. Now, without getting overly influenced by what's out there and what people get paid to do, I want you to think what you want to do. So I asked my kids what would be fun, and for the morning class, they wanted a gothic jungle like Mike Mignola's Hellboy. For this class, they wanted fast food. So a landscape based on fast food. And sure enough, there aren't a whole lot of fast food fantasy landscapes that immediately come up. I'm sure they exist. So I get to invent what this might be. Here's like a donut fantasy landscape. This is one done for some McDonald's art. It could be. Yeah, it's good concept art for something like that. But you'll notice they all kind of make sense. So you have this kind of flat cutout sun, right? But everything looks like it's kind of a diorama. There's not a lot of atmosphere or soft edges. So this is, it's a pretty fun composite. So this might be my inspiration for what I'm looking for. Cool. Weird 70s characters. very strange.